The sound of my shoes echoed softly against the marble floor as I walked through the courthouse hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. I hadn't been in a courtroom for over 20 years, not since the day I testified in a case that changed another family's life forever. But today wasn't about the past. Today, I was here for my son. When I opened the courtroom door, all eyes turned. The air shifted instantly. The chatter stopped. The judge, who had been flipping through his notes, looked up and froze. His pen slipped from his hand. He stared for a few seconds, then leaned forward, his expression changing from formality to shock. "Why are you here?" he whispered, the words barely audible but heavy enough to silence the room completely. The lawyers paused mid-sentence. My son, Daniel, turned around in confusion. And then there was her, Lisa, my daughter-in-law. Her confident smirk disappeared the moment our eyes met. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, whispering something to her lawyer. I didn't answer the judge. I simply nodded politely and walked to the back row, taking a quiet seat behind Daniel. The whispers began, soft, cautious, curious. They wanted to know why the judge looked like he had seen a ghost. They wanted to know what I was doing there. But no one asked out loud. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my purse. Inside it was a single brown folder, nothing fancy, no words written on it. But what was inside that folder could change everything about this case. Lisa turned again, her eyes darting between me and Daniel. Her mother, seated beside her, looked equally startled. I caught the quick exchange of fear on their faces. It told me something they didn't mean to reveal. They weren't as confident as they pretended to be. The judge cleared his throat, straightened his glasses, and called the room to order again. "Let's proceed." His voice was calm, but I could sense the tension. He was the same man I had once helped years ago, when his sister's property case nearly cost her everything. My testimony back then had exposed the fraud that saved his family's name. Maybe that's why he reacted the way he did when he saw me today. I focused on Daniel. My son looked tired, worn down by weeks of accusations and lies. His shoulders slumped as Lisa's lawyer began his performance, painting Daniel as a selfish husband, a man who allegedly drained his wife's finances and left her emotionally broken. Each word pierced through me. Lies, all of it. And yet, Daniel sat still, his jaw tight, eyes hollow. He had lost the energy to defend himself. Lisa sat there looking confident again, pretending to wipe away tears. Her lawyer handed her a tissue at the perfect moment, like it had all been rehearsed. I could almost admire the performance if it weren't so cruel. As the hearing continued, I listened carefully. My instincts told me to stay quiet for now. Every lie they told would dig their own hole deeper. Every exaggerated statement would make the truth stand out sharper when the time came. I leaned forward slightly, watching Lisa's every move. Her eyes avoided mine now, her hands fidgeted, her legs crossed and uncrossed. She was nervous, and I knew why. She didn't think I would come. She didn't think I'd ever know what she'd done behind Daniel's back. My heart ached. Not because of her lies, but because I remembered when she first entered our lives. She had been polite, sweet, even humble. She brought Daniel joy, or so I thought. I welcomed her like a daughter. I had no idea she would one day try to destroy the same man who gave her everything. As her lawyer continued, I opened my purse quietly, just enough to touch the folder inside. Its contents were safe. Bank records, emails, messages, evidence of false claims. I had spent nights gathering every piece of proof, without Daniel's knowledge. He was too broken to fight, but I wasn't. I looked up again at the judge. His eyes met mine for a moment. He gave a small nod, almost unnoticeable, as if to say he understood. I didn't need to explain. The truth would speak for itself soon enough. Across the room, Lisa's family exchanged whispers. Her father looked uneasy. Her mother kept glancing at me. They knew something wasn't right. Their confidence was cracking. My son turned once more, catching my eye. He looked confused, maybe even afraid. I smiled gently, the kind of smile only a mother can give. a promise that everything would be all right. He didn't need to know the details yet. All he needed was to know I was there, and I wasn't leaving. Minutes passed like hours. The lawyer droned on, waving papers, making accusations. Each word only strengthened my resolve. I remembered what my husband used to say. When people fight with lies, let them talk. They'll give you all the proof you need. He was right. The courtroom felt heavy, thick with tension. The judge finally called for a short recess. Everyone stood. Lisa turned quickly to her lawyer, whispering something urgent. He looked concerned now. Maybe she had realized that I wasn't here by coincidence. I stood slowly, adjusting my scarf, and looked toward her one last time before leaving the room for the break. She avoided my gaze again. Fear had replaced arrogance. I stepped into the hallway, exhaling deeply. My heartbeat steadied. The plan was working. Timing mattered more than words. Inside my bag, the folder felt heavier than ever, not from its contents, but from the weight of what it represented: truth. The truth she thought would never surface. The truth that would free my son and destroy the lies she had built her case on. I walked to the restroom mirror, looked at my reflection, and whispered to myself. They thought I'd stay silent. They were wrong. When I returned to the courtroom, everyone turned again. Lisa's lawyer looked uneasy. The judge adjusted his glasses. I sat back in my seat, calm and composed. No one knew what I held. No one except me. What they didn't know was that I held the one piece of evidence that could change everything. Would you speak up in public if your silence meant someone innocent would suffer? Subscribe, like, and share. Daniel was never a weak man. He was the kind of son any mother would be proud of: steady, hardworking, respectful. He had inherited his father's calm strength, and for years, I believed that no one could ever break that. Then Lisa entered his life. At first, she seemed like a blessing. Polite, well-spoken, charming. She laughed easily, listened carefully, and looked at Daniel with the kind of admiration every man hopes for. I remember thinking how lucky he was. For the first time since his father's passing, I saw Daniel truly smile again. Their courtship moved quickly. Within months, they were inseparable. She called me Mom even before the wedding, always offering to help with chores or dinner. I didn't see it then, but her kindness was measured, strategic. Every gesture was designed to win trust. The first sign came after their wedding. It was small, harmless, even. Lisa began managing their finances. She said she wanted to organize things since Daniel was too busy with work. I thought it was normal. A wife taking responsibility. But soon, every financial decision went through her. Then came the changes in Daniel's behavior. He called less. Our weekly dinners stopped. When I asked if something was wrong, he said Lisa wanted space for them to grow as a couple. I understood, or at least I tried to. Months passed, and my son grew distant. His laughter faded. His eyes lost the calm light they once carried. He became cautious with his words, like he was afraid to say the wrong thing. Whenever I mentioned visiting, he hesitated. One afternoon, I called unexpectedly. Lisa answered. Her tone was cold. "He's busy," she said before hanging up. No explanation, no courtesy. I stared at my phone, confused and hurt. Later that night, Daniel called back, his voice tight. "Mom, please don't call when I'm not home. Lisa doesn't like it." I froze. That wasn't my son speaking. That was a man walking on eggshells. Weeks turned into months. The distance grew. Friends he had known for years stopped hearing from him. His colleagues said he was withdrawn at work. I saw him only during family events, and even then, Lisa stayed glued to his side, answering questions for him, controlling every topic. It was subtle at first, small interruptions, finishing his sentences, dismissing his opinions with playful jokes. But I saw the pattern. She was shrinking him down piece by piece, until the confident man I raised became a shadow. I remember one dinner vividly. I had invited them over, trying to reconnect. Halfway through the meal, Daniel reached for the wine bottle. Lisa stopped him with a sharp look. "You've had enough," she said quietly. But her tone carried power. He set the glass down immediately. I watched in silence. That wasn't a partnership, that was control. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty plates. Something inside me broke that night. I knew my son wasn't happy, but I also knew if I tried to intervene directly, Lisa would twist it. She had already planted seeds of mistrust. The next week, Daniel came by alone. He looked thinner, exhausted. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Over tea, he finally spoke. "She said she'll leave me if I keep seeing you this often," he whispered. His voice cracked. "She says you don't like her, that you're trying to turn me against her." I wanted to speak, to tell him the truth. But the pain in his eyes silenced me. I simply nodded, placing my hand over his. "Then don't worry about me," I said softly. "I'll always be here, no matter what." He looked down, ashamed. Then he left. That was the last time I saw him truly open up. After that, Lisa made sure I stayed away. Every visit was scheduled. Every conversation is monitored. I became an outsider in my own son's life. Still, I observed quietly. From a distance, I saw Lisa and her family's lifestyle grow lavish. New cars, luxury clothes, vacations abroad. All while Daniel's company struggled financially. He worked longer hours, took loans, even sold one of his properties. It didn't make sense, until I started noticing the paper trail. Transactions from his accounts that didn't match his spending. Donations to family investments that led to nowhere. And Lisa's father bragging in the community about his business expansions. I realized then what was happening. Lisa wasn't just controlling Daniel emotionally, she was draining him, using him. And he was too broken to fight back. My heart burned with anger, but I held it in. Direct confrontation would only drive him further into her grasp. So, I waited. Quietly. Watching. Gathering small details. And then one day, something shifted. Lisa grew careless. Her arrogance started to show. She boasted about her power over Daniel to friends, confident that no one would ever question her. She didn't know I was listening that day. She didn't know that her pride would be her undoing. I went home that evening and sat by my window, looking at the fading light. I whispered to myself, "Let her keep playing her game. Because soon, she'll walk right into her own trap." For the first time in years, I didn't feel helpless. I felt clarity. The kind that only comes when truth finally takes shape. But Lisa's arrogance would soon push her into a trap of her own making. The first time Margaret saw the court papers, her hands trembled. Her son's name was printed in bold letters beside words she never imagined would be attached to him. Abuse, control, manipulation. Lisa had filed for divorce. The accusations were ugly, deliberate, and false. Daniel sat on the couch, silent. His shoulders slumped forward, eyes hollow. "Mom," he said quietly, "she says I took her money, that I controlled her life." His voice cracked halfway through. Margaret's chest tightened. "And is any of that true?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, I gave her everything. Every account, every card. She handled the bills. I thought I was making her happy." Lisa had been clever. From the outside, she looked perfect, polite, charming, well-dressed. But Margaret had seen her sharpness in private moments. The way she rolled her eyes at Daniel's words, the quiet threats when she didn't get what she wanted. Over time, Daniel had become a shadow of himself. Now, she was trying to finish what she started. Lisa's family rallied behind her instantly. They came to court with lawyers, witnesses, and fake smiles. The story they spun painted Daniel as a monster who drained Lisa financially and emotionally. Even in the first hearing, Margaret could see how Lisa's crocodile tears moved the crowd. But Margaret wasn't fooled. She sat quietly behind her son, her expression calm but alert. Years of motherhood had taught her to listen more than speak. Every time Lisa's lawyer presented a document, Margaret noticed the small inconsistencies, mismatched signatures, wrong transaction dates, incomplete records. Something was off. That night, she went home and began her own quiet investigation. She requested copies of the case filings through an old friend at the courthouse. When she compared the evidence to Daniel's old bank statements, the pattern became clearer. Money had been leaving his account in small amounts, but not to any household expense. The transfers were directed to names Margaret didn't recognize. She traced one. It led to a shell company registered under a name very similar to Lisa's cousin's. Another was tied to a luxury boutique Lisa often boasted about. Margaret sat back in her chair, realization washing over her. Lisa wasn't just manipulating Daniel emotionally, she was laundering his money. Still, Margaret kept quiet. She couldn't alert Lisa yet. If Lisa sensed suspicion, she'd cover her tracks completely. So Margaret played her role, the old, harmless mother who sat silently in the courtroom, clutching her handbag, pretending to be confused. In reality, every hearing gave her more clues. She observed Lisa's lawyer, a confident man who spoke too smoothly, too rehearsed. He avoided eye contact with Daniel, but always looked to Lisa for approval. It was clear they were working closely, perhaps too closely. Then one afternoon, Margaret noticed something strange. When Lisa's lawyer submitted an updated statement, the bank logo at the top didn't match the official one Margaret had from Daniel's files. A forgery. Her instincts flared. She went home, took out a small notebook, and began documenting everything. Names, dates, transactions, the lawyer's words, and Lisa's reactions. Each detail was written meticulously. Days turned into weeks. The court drama grew. Reporters began circling the case because of Lisa's family influence. To the public, Daniel looked like the villain. To Margaret, he was a wounded son trapped in a web of deceit. Late one night, Daniel called her. "Mom, should I just settle?" His voice sounded defeated. Margaret took a long breath. "No," she said firmly. "You don't fight lies by surrendering. You fight them with truth. Quiet, patient truth." He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. By the next morning, Margaret had printed every document she gathered. She made multiple copies and hid them in safe places. One in her home, another with a friend, and one sealed envelope with her attorney. She wasn't ready to strike, but she wanted to be prepared. The next hearing would be the turning point. Lisa didn't know it, but the walls around her scheme were slowly closing in. Margaret watched as Lisa strutted into the courtroom in her designer coat, surrounded by family, whispering smugly to her lawyer. Her confidence was absolute, but that arrogance would soon betray her. Margaret's thoughts were calm and measured as she stared at the woman who had taken her son's spirit. "Keep smiling," she thought. "You've already dug your own grave." She folded her hands and waited, her mind running through the evidence she'd gathered, transfers, signatures, hidden names. She knew her next move had to be timed perfectly. "I knew I couldn't stop her lies, but I could make sure they destroyed no one else." Margaret had always believed that silence could be powerful, that quiet observation often revealed more than loud accusations ever could. Now, in the stillness of her living room, that belief guided her every move. Stacks of papers surrounded her, bank statements, old transaction records, even printed email exchanges Daniel had forgotten existed. She studied them carefully, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose, pen tapping rhythmically on the table. Lisa had been careful. The transfers were small, spread across months, disguised as household expenses and consulting fees. But Margaret noticed one peculiar pattern. The same initials appearing at the end of multiple transfers, RT. She didn't recognize them at first, but after cross-checking a few documents, she found a clue. In one of Lisa's old messages to Daniel, she had mentioned her brother, Ryan Thompson, a man who worked in financial consulting. Margaret remembered him. Quiet, calculating, the kind who never smiled unless he was winning. The initials matched. Her heart beat faster. This wasn't just greed. It was a coordinated theft. Margaret began to search for digital traces. Daniel had once given her his old laptop when he upgraded, and it still contained synced access to his shared cloud drive. When she opened it, she saw folders titled Family Expenses, Joint Savings, and Lisa's Projects. Inside one folder, she found scanned invoices and PDF receipts. Some were legitimate, grocery bills, utility payments. But others were bizarre. One showed payment to a consulting service with no address. Another listed investment transfers to an offshore account. She clicked through each file slowly, documenting every anomaly. With each new document, the scale of Lisa's deception became clearer. The money had been funneled through multiple paths, a maze designed to confuse anyone trying to trace it. Margaret printed copies, highlighted key names, and placed them in neatly labeled folders. The old wooden clock in her living room ticked softly as she worked late into the night. Occasionally, she'd pause to sip coffee and steady her shaking hands. What she was uncovering wasn't only a crime, it was the betrayal of her family's trust. She moved next to the phone logs. She requested the call history under Daniel's account, pretending it was for billing review. The records came a few days later. As she scanned through the list, the same number kept appearing late at night, the same RT again. Lisa had been talking to her brother almost every evening, often for over an hour. Some calls were followed by bank transactions the next morning. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The truth was ugly, but at least it was visible now. Her next step was to preserve everything safely. She copied every digital file, the statements, emails, screenshots, onto a small USB drive she had bought secretly. Then, she created 2 duplicates and hid them in different places. One in a flower vase in her bedroom, another behind the family portrait in the hallway. The original stayed locked in her handbag. Daniel didn't know any of this. She couldn't tell him yet. He was too emotionally fragile, too easily manipulated by guilt. He still loved Lisa. Or at least the version of her he thought he knew. Margaret wanted him protected by facts, not emotions. As days passed, she gathered more evidence. She managed to retrieve email backups that Lisa had carelessly left accessible on Daniel's shared tablet. One message caught her attention immediately. Ryan, make sure the next transfer goes through the Cayman route. He won't notice. He never checks statements anyway. Once the case starts, we'll freeze the accounts on our side, so he looks like the one hoarding money. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. That was it, clear proof of intent. She printed the email and slipped it into her folder marked Primary Evidence. Then she added a note beside it, to be presented only if necessary. The more she read, the more she realized how far Lisa was willing to go. She wasn't content with divorce or money. She wanted to ruin Daniel's reputation, to make him look like a criminal so she could keep everything. Margaret's nights became longer. She'd sit in front of the dimly lit laptop, scrolling through lines of transactions and emails. Her eyes burning but her resolve unshaken. She barely slept. When Daniel called to check on her, she pretended everything was fine. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked one evening. "I'm fine," she replied, voice calm. "I'm just praying this ends soon." But inside, she was preparing for a war that Lisa didn't even know had begun. On a cold Thursday night, around 11 p.m., Margaret received an anonymous message on her phone. It came from a blocked number. The text read, "If you care about Daniel, tell him to drop the case. She's going to destroy him completely." Her hand tightened around the phone. She reread the message 3 times, her heart pounding. So someone knew she was involved. Someone wanted to scare her off. She locked her doors, turned off the lights, and sat in silence. The glow of the phone screen, the only light in the room. The message wasn't just a warning. It was confirmation that Lisa's plan was about to reach its peak. And now Margaret had to decide her next move. Then one night, I received a message that made everything clear. Lisa was planning to destroy him completely. The night before the court hearing, The air in Margaret's house felt heavier than usual. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan did little to ease her thoughts. Every tick of the clock seemed to remind her that morning was coming, and with it, a battle she couldn't avoid. Daniel sat across from her at the dining table. His eyes were tired, hollow from weeks of stress. He hadn't been eating much, and the gentle slump in his shoulders told her what his voice didn't. "Mom," he began softly, "I don't want you at the hearing tomorrow." Margaret froze. She had expected hesitation, maybe nerves, but not this. "Why?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. "Lisa's lawyer." He trailed off, rubbing his hands together. "They warned me. They said if you show up, it'll look like we're trying to manipulate the court, like you're influencing me. They might use it against me." She watched him closely. The boy she raised to be strong, principled, and honest was now afraid, not of the law, but of the lies that surrounded him. "Daniel," she said quietly, "truth doesn't fear presence. Only lies do." He shook his head. "Mom, please. I can handle this. I don't want you dragged into this mess." Margaret's lips curved in a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "All right," she whispered, "if that's what you want." But deep down, she knew she wouldn't obey that request. After Daniel left, the house felt emptier. She sat by the window, staring into the dark sky. The lake beyond her backyard reflected faint moonlight. That same lake where her late husband used to sit and talk about integrity, justice, and courage. His voice echoed in her mind. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's surrender. She stood slowly, her decision made. Margaret walked into her study and opened the drawer beneath her desk. Inside was the thick brown folder. Documents neatly arranged, emails printed, photos clipped, and a small USB drive labeled Proof. She ran her fingers over the edges of the papers. Every page held weeks of sleepless nights, quiet strategy, and the will to protect her son from being ruined by deceit. She opened the folder once more, reviewing each piece. Her lawyer's contact, the copies she made, even the timeline she drafted in her own handwriting, all perfectly organized. She couldn't leave anything to chance. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She knelt beside her bed and prayed. "God," she whispered, "if truth needs a voice tomorrow, let it be mine. Give me strength to speak only when needed, and to hold my peace when silence will serve better." Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She had done enough of that. This was not a night for tears. It was a night for resolve. The clock struck midnight. Margaret stood, exhaled deeply, and set her alarm for dawn. When morning came, the sky was gray. The air outside smelled of rain. She dressed carefully, a black skirt, a matching jacket, and a pearl brooch that belonged to her late husband. Her reflection in the mirror looked calm, but her eyes carried years of experience and quiet determination. She slipped the folder into her handbag, double-checking that everything was secure. As she locked her door, she noticed her hands tremble slightly. She wasn't afraid of Lisa or her lawyers. She was afraid of what this might do to her son, the pain of watching his illusion of love crumble. But some truths had to shatter illusions to free the heart. The taxi ride to the courthouse was silent. Margaret kept her handbag close, staring out the window as the city moved past, morning traffic, people in suits, the world unaware of the storm about to break in Courtroom 3. When the car stopped, she stepped out, straightened her jacket, and looked up at the courthouse steps. Rain began to fall lightly, speckling her sleeves. It didn't matter. She walked forward with steady steps, each one echoing a silent promise. This ends today. As she approached the courtroom doors, she saw Daniel inside through the glass panel. He looked nervous, seated at the plaintiff's table, avoiding eye contact with Lisa, who sat across from him with her lawyer, confident, composed, smirking faintly. Margaret hesitated for a brief moment. She thought of her son's words, "I don't want you there." Then she thought of the lies stacked against him, the false evidence, the cruelty disguised as confidence, and she pushed the door open, every head turned. The judge hadn't entered yet. but the murmurs began instantly. Lisa's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently. Lisa's face paled as Margaret walked past them and quietly took a seat behind her son. Daniel turned around in shock. "Mom!" She raised her hand slightly, signaling him to stay calm. Then she smiled faintly, whispering, "I'm here. That's all that matters." Moments later, the bailiff called for silence. The judge entered, adjusting his robe and glancing briefly at the gallery. His eyes swept across the room, then froze. His expression shifted. His steps slowed. When his gaze met Margaret's, recognition flashed. He looked stunned, confused, and then, in a low voice that cut through the silence, he said, "Why are you here?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lisa's smirk vanished. Daniel looked from the judge to his mother, bewildered. Margaret said nothing. She simply folded her hands on her lap and met the judge's stare with calm certainty. He knew her, and he knew this was no ordinary case. "When I entered that courtroom, I didn't know the judge would remember me. Would you go against your child's wishes if you knew the truth could save them?" The air inside the courtroom grew heavier as the hearing began. Every shuffle of paper, every cough from the gallery, every click of a pen echoed like thunder. Margaret sat quietly behind her son, her hands clasped around her handbag, the same one carrying the truth that could unravel everything. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing again at her before turning to the lawyers. His eyes lingered a second too long, as if trying to confirm what memory whispered. Then his expression softened. "Mrs. Walker," he said slowly, "we've met before, haven't we?" The room went silent. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to stop. Margaret nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor. Many years ago." Recognition dawned on his face. The courtroom murmured as he leaned back slightly, studying her. "You testified in the Martin case," he said quietly. "The one that saved my sister's reputation." Margaret gave a faint smile. "I only told the truth." The judge's lips pressed together, and a subtle shift passed through the room, respect, tension, and unease. He cleared his throat and turned his attention to Lisa's lawyer. "Proceed." Lisa sat tall, confident again, though her eyes flickered nervously toward Margaret. Her lawyer rose with exaggerated composure. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a straightforward matter of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. My client, Mrs. Lisa Walker, has suffered deeply under Mr. Daniel Walker's control. We have documents showing he diverted family funds without consent." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd seen those documents. Forgeries built on stolen data. Lies layered with false timestamps. The lawyer continued, holding up a stack of papers. "These statements show large, unexplained withdrawals from joint accounts. My client was unaware of these transactions." Lisa lowered her eyes in feigned distress, dabbing at imaginary tears with a tissue. Her family, seated behind her, nodded with false sympathy. Margaret's heart pounded. Each lie landed like a hammer. She glanced at Daniel, silent, defeated, staring at the floor. The judge reviewed the documents briefly. His brow furrowed. Something didn't add up. "Mr. Walker," the judge said, addressing Daniel, "do you have any explanation for these records?" Daniel hesitated. "Your Honor, I never." Before he could finish, Margaret stood. The courtroom turned toward her. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "may I approach?" Lisa's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, she's not on the witness list." But the judge raised his hand. "Sit down, counselor. Mrs. Walker, proceed." Margaret stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Every step carried decades of composure, patience, and quiet strength. She placed the brown folder on the judge's desk with steady hands. "These," she said clearly, "are the original financial statements, email transcripts, and bank confirmations. They show who made those transfers and where the money went." The lawyer scoffed. "Your Honor, this is irregular." The judge ignored him, opening the folder. He adjusted his glasses and began comparing the documents side by side. line by line, signature by signature. Minutes passed in thick silence. Then, the judge's eyes narrowed. He held up one sheet from Lisa's evidence and another from Margaret's. The difference was undeniable. Different fonts, altered signatures, fake letterheads. He leaned back slowly, setting the papers down. "Mrs. Walker," he said, turning to Lisa, "would you care to explain why your financial records show evidence of digital forgery?" Lisa's lawyer blanched. "Your Honor, there must be—" "Silence," the judge snapped. "I recognize an official bank format when I see one. These documents," he said, tapping Margaret's folder, "are verifiable originals. The others have been altered." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lisa's confident mask cracked. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. The judge looked directly at her. "Mrs. Walker, I am giving you one chance to explain before I forward this evidence for forensic review." Lisa swallowed hard, her lips quivering. I don't know what happened. Maybe there was a mistake." Margaret stood quietly to the side, watching without satisfaction. She hadn't come for revenge. She'd come for truth. The judge flipped another page, frowning deeper. "And what about these transfers to a secondary account under your brother's name? Would you call that a mistake too?" Lisa froze. Her brother, seated at the back, shifted uncomfortably, trying to avoid attention. The lawyer's face turned gray. Daniel turned toward his mother slowly, realization washing over him. For weeks, he had doubted himself. Now he understood. He'd been betrayed, framed by the very person who swore she loved him. The judge gathered the papers, tapping them neatly on his desk. He looked at Lisa once more, his tone low but sharp. "You have some explaining to do." The words landed like a hammer. The silence afterward was absolute. No one dared breathe. Lisa's lawyer sank into his chair. Her parents looked away, their arrogance evaporating. Margaret returned to her seat, her expression calm, her heartbeat steady. She'd done her part. The truth was now in the open, and justice had taken its first breath. Daniel turned and met her eyes. There was no need for words. He mouthed, "Thank you." She gave a small nod, holding his gaze. As the bailiff collected the evidence and the judge called for a recess, Margaret sat back and exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, she felt peace. Not triumph, peace. But deep inside, she knew the storm wasn't over yet. Exposing the truth was one thing, watching it tear apart what remained of her family would be another. Lisa's face went pale as the judge turned toward her and said, "You have some explaining to do." The courtroom felt colder that morning, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Lisa's eyes darted from the judge to her lawyer, to Daniel, the man she'd tried to bury under lies. Her confidence, once sharp as glass, was now cracking under the weight of truth. Her lawyer stumbled through his words, papers shaking in his hand. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The defense. The judge interrupted, his tone steady and unimpressed. "What's irregular is presenting forged documents in my courtroom. We will verify everything." Lisa's face drained of color. Daniel sat motionless, unable to look at anyone. His jaw clenched, his hands trembling on his lap. He wasn't angry, he was hollow, realizing how far his wife had gone to destroy him. Margaret sat 2 rows behind, her black outfit neat and composed. She didn't flinch, didn't celebrate. Justice wasn't joy, it was duty. She had done what she had to do. When the judge called for a recess, whispers filled the room like wind through broken glass. Reporters shifted forward. Court officers exchanged looks. Daniel turned to his mother at last, eyes wet and voice unsteady. "You knew?" he whispered. "I did," Margaret said softly. "And I couldn't let you be torn apart for her lies." He nodded, but said nothing more. Years of love and silence passed between them in a glance. Outside, in the corridor, the cameras were waiting. Lisa stormed out first, her heels striking hard against the marble floor. The flash of lights hit her face as she spun toward Margaret. "You ruined everything!" Lisa hissed. "You think you're some saint? You don't know what he did to me. Margaret met her gaze, calm and unshaken. You wanted war, she said evenly. But you forgot who you were fighting. Lisa's jaw tightened. This isn't over. It is, Margaret replied. You ended it yourself. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, Lisa's lawyer approached, trying to calm her down. But she shoved his arm away and stormed down the hall, muttering curses under her breath. The reporters followed her, the noise fading as she disappeared through the glass doors. Daniel finally stepped into the hall. He looked at his mother, the woman who had been quietly fighting behind the scenes while he was lost in despair. I didn't want you involved, he said quietly. Margaret's expression softened. You didn't need to want it. You needed someone to protect you. He looked down, ashamed. She almost destroyed me. She almost did, Margaret said. But the truth doesn't drown easily. You taught me that. When the recess ended, the air in the courtroom felt different, heavier. Lisa returned, her expression hollow, her voice stripped of its usual charm. The judge spoke slowly, reading the verified evidence. Based on the documents presented, it is clear that the plaintiff has engaged in multiple acts of fraud and falsification of evidence. This court will not tolerate such behavior. Lisa's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glare. The divorce proceedings will continue under the full understanding that Mr. Daniel Thompson is the victim of manipulation and deceit. The plaintiff will face separate charges for perjury and financial fraud. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. Lisa froze, her body tense, her eyes wild. Daniel exhaled deeply, as if breathing for the first time in months. The chains of guilt and shame fell away, replaced by quiet disbelief. Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing gently. He didn't look at her, but he held on. Then, as the bailiff approached Lisa, she turned, slowly, and looked straight at Margaret. Her lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. You'll regret this, she whispered. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't blink. The bailiff led Lisa away, her words lingering like smoke in the air. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret stood still. Justice had been served, but peace wasn't instant. Her son was free, but the damage had been deep. Emotional scars that truth alone couldn't heal. Outside, the sun had risen high, casting bright light through the courthouse windows. Margaret walked beside Daniel, both silent. When they reached the steps, Daniel finally spoke. I don't know what to say, he murmured. Say nothing, Margaret said. Just live, that's enough. He nodded slowly. Behind them, the reporters were still shouting questions. Mrs. Thompson, how did you find the evidence? Was it true about the hidden accounts? Margaret didn't respond. She walked forward, her voice calm as she said to her son, let them talk. Truth doesn't need headlines. As they left the courthouse, Daniel looked at her with quiet gratitude. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt both relief and unease. Justice had come, but Lisa's final words echoed in her mind. You'll regret this. She didn't know what Lisa meant, but she knew the story wasn't finished. But before the bailiff escorted her out, she turned to me and said, You'll regret this. The house was quiet again, too quiet. For weeks, Margaret woke up expecting another phone call, another summons, another argument echoing through her mind. But there was only silence, the kind that settles after a storm. Lisa's name filled the local papers for days. Fraud, forgery, perjury. Her face, once painted with charm, was now printed beside words like disgraced and convicted. The judgment had been swift, but the damage it left behind was slow to fade. Daniel stayed with Margaret for a while. He didn't talk much, only sat by the kitchen window most mornings, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. His eyes looked clearer now, though the shadows of shame still lingered. They seized her accounts, he said one morning. The cars, the house, all gone. I didn't even know she had so much. Margaret nodded. That kind of wealth never lasts, not when it's built on lies. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The truth was enough. Weeks passed. Margaret returned to her garden, her small world of peace. The soil welcomed her again, soft and forgiving. Each seed she planted felt like a quiet confession. She wasn't proud of what had happened, but she didn't regret it either. Sometimes, neighbors would stop at the gate, pretending to greet her while trying to dig for gossip. "Such a shame about Daniel's wife," one said. "We always thought she was so kind." Margaret smiled faintly. "People often mistake charm for kindness," she said. Then she returned to her plants. She didn't need to explain anything to anyone. Truth didn't need witnesses. It only needed endurance. Daniel began to rebuild, piece by piece. He found a new job, smaller but honest. He sold the luxury car Lisa had insisted on and bought a used one. He spent evenings reading, fixing things around the house, and walking in silence. One evening, he joined Margaret on the porch. The air was cool, and the sky stretched wide, painted in soft gold. "You were right," he said. Margaret looked up from her knitting. "About what?" "About her. About everything." "I didn't want to see it." "You were in love," she said simply. "Love can make fools of the best men." He smiled faintly. "I was more than a fool. I was blind." "No," she replied. "You were kind, and she mistook kindness for weakness." "That's on her." Daniel looked out at the horizon. "Do you ever feel sorry for her?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes. But pity is all that's left for people who trade love for greed." They sat quietly after that, the sounds of night beginning to hum around them. Days turned into weeks. Margaret went back to church, to market, to her quiet routines. But sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she still saw Lisa's face, pale, trembling, whispering those last words before being taken away. "You'll regret this." She didn't believe in curses, but the memory clung to her. Not as fear, but as a reminder that truth always costs something. Then, one morning, it happened. The mail had been delivered early. Margaret walked to the gate as usual, her slippers brushing against the pavement. The air smelled faintly of rain. She opened the rusty mailbox and pulled out a small pile of envelopes, bills, a flyer, and one unmarked letter. No return address. She paused. The paper was thick, folded neatly, and sealed with glue. The handwriting across the front was clean and familiar, a looping cursive she had seen 100 times on birthday cards and shopping lists. Lisa's handwriting. Margaret stood still, staring at it. Her first instinct was to drop it straight into the bin. To end it there, without another word from a woman whose lies had nearly ruined her son. But something stopped her. Curiosity, maybe. Or closure. She turned the envelope in her hands, the edges slightly smudged as if touched by nervous fingers. Her pulse quickened. Was it an apology? A threat? A plea for help? She went back inside and placed it on the kitchen table. Daniel wasn't home yet. The clock ticked steadily in the background. She poured herself a cup of tea, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it. The letter sat there, silent and heavy. Margaret's eyes stayed on it for a long time. She thought of everything, the lies, the trial, the shame, the night spent collecting evidence in secret. And now, a piece of paper that could reopen everything she had fought to close. She set the cup down. The tea rippled. Then she whispered to herself, "Some truths deserve to stay buried." But even as she said it, her hand moved closer. She touched the edge of the envelope, tracing the familiar handwriting with her thumb. Her heart beat faster. The world around her went still. Then one morning, I found a letter in my mailbox, with no return address, and Lisa's handwriting. The morning sunlight poured softly through the curtains as Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table. The envelope still lay before her, untouched since yesterday. She had avoided it all night, pacing the floors, trying to convince herself that she didn't need to know what was inside. But the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it called to her. At last, she picked it up, took a slow breath, and broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the same elegant handwriting that once wrote cheerful notes and fake smiles. The words were shaky, the ink slightly smeared, as if written in haste or regret. Margaret began to read. Margaret, if you're reading this, then I have lost everything. Maybe it's what I deserve. I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't leave things unsaid. You were right about me. About the lies. About everything. Margaret's eyes stayed on the words. Calm, but cold. She kept reading. I didn't start out wanting to destroy Daniel. I loved him. I swear I did. But somewhere along the way, pride took over. I wanted control. I wanted to be the one who mattered most in his life. When you started questioning things, I panicked. I thought if I could keep him away from you, I'd win. But what was I winning, really? A man who was slowly breaking because of me? Margaret paused. Her heart felt heavy, but not broken. The words carried guilt, but not repentance. Lisa went on. When the money started moving, I told myself it was temporary. I said I'd return it later. I just needed to feel powerful, to prove something. My family pushed me too. They said I was weak for letting Daniel make decisions. They laughed at me. So I took what I could, told myself I deserved it. Pride became poison, and I drank it daily. Margaret let the page fall slightly. Her throat tightened. Pride, fear, and pressure. The oldest excuses in the book. She turned the page over and read the last lines. I'm sorry for how I treated your son. I'm sorry for the lies. I don't hate you, Margaret. I feared you. You saw through me when no one else did. If there's anything left of me worth remembering, let it be that I finally told the truth, even if too late. There was no signature. Only a faint smudge at the bottom, a teardrop, maybe, or spilled ink. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, "Too late doesn't undo what you've done." She stood up and walked to the cabinet by the hallway. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a small metal box, the same one that held her copies of evidence, receipts, and photos. She placed the letter inside, locked it, and set the key in her apron pocket. Pity filled her, but forgiveness did not. Forgiveness, she thought, wasn't a gift to the guilty. It was a healing for the wounded, and she wasn't ready to heal yet. Hours passed. Daniel returned home, his mood lighter these days. You got mail earlier, he said casually, seeing the now empty envelope on the table. I read it, she said simply. He nodded, unsure what to ask. Do you feel better? No, she replied, but I feel finished. That night, she sat by her window. The moon was high, casting silver light across the room. She thought of Lisa, not the liar, not the manipulator, but the broken woman sitting somewhere in silence, probably realizing too late what her greed had cost. Margaret felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, but release. And then, as she reached to close the letter's envelope, something caught her eye. A small slip of paper had fallen out from underneath the folded page. Thinner, slightly yellowed. She hadn't noticed it before. It was wedged inside the envelope seam, almost hidden. Her pulse quickened as she pulled it free. It wasn't in Lisa's handwriting. The letters were sharper, straighter, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. She unfolded it slowly. There were only a few words written there. Margaret, we should talk. There's more you don't know, Charles. She froze. Charles, her late husband's old friend. The same man who had handled some of Daniel's early investments. The one she trusted. The one who had vanished from their lives right around the time Lisa's lies began. Her fingers trembled as she held the note closer. The ink was old but legible. More you don't know. The phrase echoed in her mind like a warning. Had he been part of it? Did Lisa confess everything? Or only part of it? Margaret leaned back in her chair. The room spinning with questions. The truth she thought was complete suddenly felt fragile again, cracked open by a single hidden note. She looked at the two pieces of paper on her table, one from a woman begging for forgiveness, the other from a man hinting at deeper secrets. Her jaw tightened. "I thought this was over," she whispered. "But maybe it isn't." The night stretched on, quiet and cold. Margaret didn't sleep. She kept the second note in her hand, its edges warm from her grip. Something told her this wasn't the end. At the bottom of the envelope was something else, a second note, written by someone I thought I could trust. The morning sun was soft and golden when Margaret finally decided to read the second note again. Her hands were steady this time. She unfolded the paper and saw that she'd been mistaken in the dim light before. The handwriting wasn't Charles's. It belonged to a woman. At the bottom, signed in careful script, were the words, "Helen, Lisa's mother." Margaret read slowly. "Margaret, you don't know me well, but I owe you a truth. I raised Lisa to believe she had to fight for everything. I never taught her balance, humility, or patience. I filled her head with pride and fear. Watching what she's become breaks me. Thank you for protecting your son, and mine, in a way. If not for you, more lives would have been destroyed. I don't ask forgiveness. I only ask that you remember her as human. Weak, but human. You ended the cycle of deceit that I started. For that, I'm grateful." Margaret folded the letter carefully. There was no bitterness in her now, only quiet understanding. The storm had passed, leaving Stillwater behind. That afternoon, she went to see Daniel. He was at the small cafe near the courthouse, sipping coffee and reading through new job offers. He looked healthier, lighter, as if a weight had finally lifted. When he saw his mother approach, he smiled faintly. "You're early," he said. Margaret sat down across from him. "Old habits," she replied. "You know I hate being late." They talked for a while, about work, about the house he was fixing up, about how peaceful everything felt. Daniel's voice carried a calm Margaret hadn't heard in years. As they stood to leave, they passed the courthouse steps. The same courthouse where everything had changed. Margaret slowed her walk and looked up at the tall, silent building. Daniel noticed. "You're thinking about that day, aren't you?" She nodded. "The judge asked why I was there." He smiled softly. "And why were you?" Margaret looked straight ahead, eyes firm. "To make sure justice didn't lose its voice." They walked in silence after that. The kind of silence that meant peace, not distance. Later that evening, Margaret visited the cemetery. The air was cool, the sky washed in pale orange light. She brought fresh flowers, white lilies, her husband's favorite, and placed them gently by his headstone. She knelt and brushed a bit of dust from the carved name. "He's safe now," she whispered. "Our boy's safe." For a moment, she thought of everything that had happened. The lies, the court battles, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt. Every memory was sharp, but no longer painful. They were lessons carved into time. She stood there for a long while, watching the sun fade behind the trees. A soft wind stirred the leaves, and she felt something like closure in the quiet. As she turned to leave, her thoughts came together like the final lines of a story she'd been waiting to finish. Some battles aren't won by anger, they're won by patience and truth. Lisa had lost her freedom, her reputation, and her illusions. But Margaret didn't celebrate her fall. There was no joy in watching someone break, even someone who had caused pain. The victory wasn't in seeing her punished. It was in knowing Daniel was free, standing tall again. Truth had done what shouting never could. It had spoken calmly, waited patiently, and prevailed quietly. When Margaret got home, she placed both letters, Lisa's and Helen's, inside the same box as the rest of the evidence. She sealed it and wrote a small label across the top, "Closed chapter." Then she set it on a high shelf in the study. No more courtroom visits, no more late-night worries. As she sat by the window with her cup of tea, the world outside looked calm. The same birds that once scattered during storms now perched peacefully on the fence. The thought brought her a faint smile. "They tried to break him through lies," she murmured. But the truth stood taller than all of them. She leaned back, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long while, She felt her husband's presence not as a loss, but as strength beside her. Tomorrow, life would go on. Quietly, honestly, without fear. And if anyone ever asked her again why she walked into that courtroom that day, she already knew her answer. The judge asked why I was there. The answer was simple: to make sure justice didn't lose its voice. If you believe truth always finds its way, subscribe for more true life stories of betrayal, courage, and justice.